Hi everyone, it's 2:01 now, so we'll get started. I'm Sarah Halter. I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Medical History Museum, and I'm very glad to be here with you today for the 1918 pandemic. Indianapolis confronts the 1918 Spanish Influenza, presented by Bill Beck and Dr. Bill McNeese of the Marion County Historical Society. Before we start, I have just a couple of housekeeping items. First, if you're having trouble with audio on your computer or you need to switch to the dial-in option for whatever reason, I've posted the phone number in the chat along with this webinar ID and the password, so you can access it that way. Because this is a webinar, your microphones and videos will remain disabled, but you can still communicate with us through the chat feature. And I would encourage you to use that chat throughout the talk to pose any questions you have. We'll be monitoring those throughout, and we should have some time at the end for a bit of Q&A. Also, we're recording this program tonight, and it will be available soon on our YouTube channel as well as on our website, which is imhm.org. Before I introduce our speakers for this afternoon, I want to tell you about a couple of other upcoming virtual events. Some of you may be aware of a series we started a couple of years ago called Gadgets and Gizmos. This program gives special donors a behind-the-scenes glimpse of odd or rare pieces from our collection that you don't normally get to see on the tour. In the past, we've featured historic artifacts like ECT machines, various laboratory equipment, IQ testing tools, and an ophthalmologist's eye testing lens kit. That's a mouthful. But for our next Gadgets and Gizmos coming up on Monday, July 27th at 5:30, we're opening it up to anyone who wants to join us. Space is limited, but you can register even if you're not a donor, and I'll post the link in the chat in just a few minutes. We also have a program coming up from our very own Norma Erickson titled When Fate Overtakes a Race Driver, about E. Rogers Smith, MD, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway's second medical officer. For its 104 runnings, only 6 different doctors have served as the CMO of the Indianapolis 500. So in the second installment of this Racing and Medicine series, medical historian Norma Erickson discusses the tenure of the second CMO, neuropsychiatrist E. Rogers Smith, who served from 1938 until 1951. That will be on Sunday, August 9th at 2 o'clock, and I'll post the link to register for that program as well. Hope we'll see you back here for both of these great programs, and I hope you'll keep in touch. We're very active on Facebook and Twitter. We're on Instagram. Please also visit our website, again, imhm.org, where you can connect with us, learn more about new projects and programs and our preservation efforts, and also check out new digital content. There you can also sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new events and new things on the website. And you'll also be the first to hear about our reopening plans when those are announced. That's all I have, so we'll go into the program now. Thank you for being with us today for what I know will be a fascinating talk. We've all been hearing a lot lately about the 1918-1919 flu pandemic and its parallels with what's going on today with COVID-19. So we're delighted to be here once again with Bill Beck and Bill McNeese, both from the Marion County Historical Society, to learn more about that pandemic and specifically how it played out in Indianapolis. They'll also talk about some of the parallels between that pandemic and the city's response to it and what we've seen this year, 102 years later, with COVID-19. Your bios aren't there. I thought I had on my notes. Bill Beck, I believe, is a graduate of what was then Marion College. He's a
now Marion University.
Right, a retired publisher and author of many published business histories. And Bill McNeese is a graduate of IU School of Medicine. He's a physician who teaches and practices pediatric anesthesiology, and he is a longtime member of a committee. I can't remember what the committee, can you fill me in, Bill? Infection prevention or something.
Well, it's currently, I think, infection prevention.
Okay, I knew there was something I was missing.
Yeah.
Thank you both for being here. I'm gonna mute myself and turn off my video, and I'll let you guys take it over. Thanks.
All righty. Well, I'm going to go to a share screen here. See if we can get this up for everyone to see. Okay. I'm hoping that everyone's seeing things now. Bill, are you seeing things on the screen?
Looks good to me.
Okay. Well, then let's go ahead and get started. We're doing this as a sort of a two-part event here today. And the reason for that is I learned that if you put too much in one file, my computer doesn't like it. So we'll be doing this as a two-part, but all over the next hour or so. So we're looking at the Indianapolis experience with the 1918 influenza pandemic. And let's start with looking some. Put back here. There we go. So we're going to focus on the period of time between September of 1918 and the end of that year. Using a lot of contemporary sources, you'll see lots from the Indianapolis Star and the Indianapolis News. And to give you a sense of the city at the time, the 1910 census, 233,000. It was the 22nd largest city in the United States. The United States is growing, Indianapolis is growing, remaining about the same proportional size, but up to about 314,000 by the end of that decade. This is an image of a map of Indianapolis from 1908. I've marked there's the streets that are bounding the edges of the map. You can see the city is expanding more to the north and the east, with White River providing something of a barrier to city growth here on the west side of the city. If we focus in on the downtown area, we can see Union Station pretty much in the center of the screen there. You'll see a variety of railroads coming in and out of there. And in the upper central part of the screen, you'll see a red square, and that marks the location of the Indianapolis Traction Terminal. This is an image of the 12 tracks that came into the station. You can see above each of the tracks the marks from the coal smoke from the steam locomotives that would have carried those back and forth. All the railroads were linked by the Belt Railroad and the Union Station. Steam railroads left Indianapolis, and as you can see from this map, went in many different directions. Union Station was a busy place. The New York Central line alone scheduled some 17 trains daily between the United States and Chicago in 1916, and that doesn't comment at all on how many of the Pennsylvania and Monon Indianapolis options there were. In 1920, there was an average of 176 passenger trains calling daily on Union Station. So lots of passengers traveling into and out of the city many times daily. Indianapolis was also a hub of electric car service. The Traction Terminal building was located on the northwest corner of West Market and North Illinois. The car shed is located to the west in this image, and a local streetcar runs past in this image. In this detail of the 1908 map shown earlier, displays some car line, or this shows some car lines coming in and out. You can see in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. So these cars carried passengers to and from and through Indianapolis, throughout the state and into nearby states as well. There was an estimated 10,000 salesmen who boarded interurban trains every Monday morning, making calls throughout the state and the region. These tracks carried passengers on a nearly hourly basis to Chicago, Louisville, Richmond, Evansville, and all points in between. There were a number of hospitals active in 1918. Here's a list of 6 of them. You can see many of them are relatively new structures in terms of the care where they could provide patients. This is the Practice of Medicine by Anders and Musser. It's a 13th edition, so it must have been a fairly successful work. This is from 1915. And if you go through it, you can find sections on influenza. Says influenza is an acute contagious disease, probably caused by the Bacillus of Pfeiffer. Well, it turned out that that really wasn't the cause. That was subsequently renamed. The influenza virus, really the cause of all this problem was not identified until 1933. But in 1917, influenza was clearly recognized as both an endemic and a pandemic disease. The incubation period was understood, along with fevers, headaches, muscle aches, prostration, all features that we recognize today of influenza. It makes note that of leading features and complications, severe bronchitis leading to bronchopulmonary pneumonia, bronchopneumonia, is a common, very serious complication, indeed the case. Makes mention of death rates up to 2% in some epidemics, but offers no specific treatments in this era. The prognosis as a whole is pretty good, but if you're in pandemic periods, then you're going to see higher complications and mortalities. So if you would be reading the local newspapers, then on Thursday, September the 12th, back on page 12, you could see that the New York has quarantined against the Spanish malady. Spanish influenza, joint aches, back aches, gastric disturbances, nasal discharges. The initial appearance in Indiana was somewhere in the mid to late September of 1918, probably up in the Calumet region, and then gradually moving from there downward into Indiana. This is from September the 19th in the Indianapolis News. Influenza outbreak severest in the East. They warn against hysteria and concern that the fear might lower the resistance to those exposed to influenza. Bill?
One of the things I'd like to point out here is if you look at the right side of your screen, this may be German work. And somebody has made the statement from the War Department, the theory that the disease, which you characterize as nothing more or less than an old-fashioned grip, might have been brought to the United States by members of the crews of German submarines. What you have to remember here about the pandemic in 1918 is that it happens, the early outbreaks happen against the backdrop of some of the more severe fighting that we have encountered in France during our 1918 offensives. Hoosiers would have been closely following the battles at Belleau Wood in the summer, and this is September 19th. In exactly 1 week, the United States will start the Meuse-Argonne offensive that leads to the collapse of the German army in the West. So take it away, Bill.
Okay. So this is an image of Jesse Feltz. He is the earliest 1918 influenza-associated burial in Crown Hill Cemetery. So he was from Indianapolis, graduates from Tech, gets married, heads up to the Great Lake Naval training for his training as a young seaman, and very soon then dies of influenza. This is an image of his stone in Crown Hill Cemetery, and he is the earliest that I know of in Indianapolis of dying. In this case, he dies September 21st up in the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, but is buried here in Indianapolis. September the 26th, there's a training detachment under quarantine. There were detachments at the School for the Deaf at Fort Benjamin Harrison. Lots of cases being reported, 125 at the School for the Deaf, 60 at Fort Ben Harrison. And the next day, influenza and deaths in the Army increased broadly. No cases yet reported in Indianapolis, but the public authorities have ordered the public places to be fumigated. Bill?
And this is, we're seeing already in September, we're seeing mass outbreaks in Army and Naval training camps. Because remember, there's hundreds of thousands of young men and young women who are training for a potential role in the war in Europe. And this institutionalization, this problem of positive cases in institutional settings is something that's very consistent with what we're seeing with COVID-19 vis-a-vis the outbreaks in nursing homes so far this spring, vis-a-vis the outbreaks in meatpacking plants.
Okay. So here on September the 27th, recommendations on how to check and stop influenza, makes recommendations for the wearing of 3 or 4 layers of sterilized gauze as an approach to limit the progress and spread of the disease. On October the 1st, 10 new influenza cases are reported, a decrease at Fort Ben Harrison. It goes on to say that Fort Ben Harrison, I think the number of cases are down. Medical officers are confident the disease is under control. By October the 1st, the tech opening is postponed. They had planned to restart school there, but that just didn't work out because they had plans to move to new quarters at the deaf school, but the influenza there slowed it down. Of the 150 carpenters working in the new mess hall, 104 are influenza victims. I'll also mention that there's a slide that thought was going to be there that talked about the September the 30th being a date when it was recognized in the community. October the 2nd, influenza causes the death of a Indianapolis soldier at Camp Devens in Massachusetts. And it becomes clear that by the second influenza is in Indianapolis, it's spreading. Health authorities remain hopeful the epidemic can be prevented if people follow the rules set out by the health authorities. Well, what works? Here's an advertisement, a promotional on the value of whole superlative. Breaks la grippe or influenza, root and bark remedy. La grippe comes on almost at once without warning, and that's true. And this is when you need whole superlative. Well, somewhat out of order, but I'll mention at least whole superlative was mentioned here in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1922, where it was promoted as, in addition to its great efficacy on influenza, being the world's greatest nerve remedy, or at least it was claimed. Federal chemists thought otherwise, found the labeling incorrect, and the company was fined a total of $40, including costs. Moving on, October the 4th, more than 30 are registered as influenza nurses. Good recognition that we're going to need to ramp up medical services and nursing services. On the 6th, 3 Hoosiers dead at Camp Zachary Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. The article reports the deaths and new cases, 350 cases discharged, but 1,100 new cases admitted, making it very clear that at least at Camp Zachary Taylor, the epidemic was not well controlled. On the 7th, there's a sweeping order by the health board. More than 130 new cases have developed over one day in Indianapolis with 4 deaths. 10 died overnight at Fort Bend. The new order affects theaters, movie houses, churches, schools, colleges, and meetings of every description except Liberty Loan Committee meetings, business houses, and manufacturing plants. There's a warning against visiting in homes and directions that funerals should only be attended by relatives and close friends. This is an obituary of Robert Elliott, published in the October 8th Indianapolis Star. Mr. Elliott was 32 years old at the time. 2 weeks prior, he and 61 other men went from Indianapolis to take jobs at the Hog Island shipbuilding yards in Philadelphia. Mr. Elliott worked there for 5 days, took sick with Spanish influenza, died a week later. Bill?
And again, you're seeing the similarities to the outbreaks that we're seeing today in, for example, meat packing plants, where everybody is tightly jammed together, carving up sides of beef or sides of hogs. This is working in a closed space inside the hull of a ship, with dozens of other workers at the same time. So no surprise that there are outbreaks in these shipbuilding facilities.
Also, Thursday, October the 10th, a ban placed on state to check the flu spread. As you will see here, the deaths are variably reported as being due to different sorts of things. But this ban is a precedent-setting rule, a first time in the history that things have been this degree of ban on all public meetings. This is also from the 11th, talking about 1353 influenza cases in the city. Now, when we talk about influenza, it's a kind of a combination of influenza and also a pneumonia. But it is apparent from the statistics here thus far that the disease has not reached its peak in Indianapolis. It recommends if you have any indications of influenza, stay at home, call a physician. What is it and how should it be treated? The date is wrong. It should be 1918. And it talks here about really nothing new here. This is a description on how to address it. James White, 32 years old, obituary appears in the October 11th issue of the Star. His cause of death is identified as Spanish influenza. His death is noted to be sudden. And that was characteristic of influenza in his age range. This is taken from the Saturday, October the 12th Star. It talks about the churches of Indianapolis being closed the following day. And indeed, in that day, there's a full page layout that includes hymns to be sung, prayers to be read, and reflections from various church leaders in Indianapolis. Here's an advertisement on that 13th, Humphrey 77, pretty much good for what ails you, certainly including influenza, at least so the company claims. Here is from the 15th, Charles Emerson, physician, then dean of the IU School of Medicine, urges keeping doctors at home due to the influenza danger. On the right, Dr. Morgan urges the greatest of caution, also banning outdoor meetings. Eli Lilly is recruiting intelligent women of Indianapolis to help with responding to the increased demands for influenza vaccine, if not already employed on essential war work. Elsewhere, there is made mention of 300 new cases of influenza. On the 17th, the influenza epidemic will probably result in continued prohibition of all public gatherings past the date of the planned opening of the fall political campaigns on October the 21st. Now, elections that year were on November the 5th. So that means that there was a planned 15-day campaign season. That would have been okay. Here's another advertisement, promotional from the Kolnook company. Remember the 3 C's to avoid influenza: clean mouth, clean skin, clean clothes. I don't exactly know what the Kolnios dental cream has to do with that, but according to the company, it would make a difference. Business was affected. Here's the indefinite postponement of the state realty meetings because of influenza. Others were affected too. This reports on the death of a clergyman, William Steinhauer, Catholic priest, making sick calls. He develops the influenza and dies soon after. Here's an obituary of Miss Eileen Isabel Miller, 28 years old, death from Spanish influenza, a graduate of the Deaconess Hospital program here in Indianapolis. This is a copy of her death certificate. It lists her cause of death as bronchial pneumonia with influenza as a contributing cause. Again, I'll mention there's a lot of overlap between bronchial pneumonia and influenza, and the bronchial pneumonia having developed as a complication of influenza. At any rate, she goes from, in 1 week, from working as a nurse to her death. October the 19th, Fletcher Savings and Trust describes the situation regarding the Spanish influenza as sufficiently serious to stop its Saturday evening business hours. The Indiana Paper Company identifies the cloth roller towel as a public health menace, a relic of the past, and a disease spreader. It goes on to make the business case for its sanitary towels, offering absolute protection from dirt and infection, and being the ideal towel. So September the 20th completes 10 days of the ban on public gatherings. There's some evidence of fewer cases, but this may just be an artifact of an earlier closing of the health office. Physicians, too, are not immune from the disease. Funeral services for Dr. Michael Scheel, 32 years old, who died of influenza. October the 24th, President Bryant at Indiana University announces IU will remain closed next week, a total of 3 weeks in all. The 24th, needing trained nurses, physicians are asked to encourage all private nurses to assist in the influenza campaign. Here's a cartoon from the front page, keep the window open, be interested in the scenery, promoting the keeping open of all of the streetcars' windows to try and keep them aired out and reduce the spread of Spanish flu, as diagrammed in this cartoon. This is from the September 25th Star. It includes a graph of reported cases in the city over the 18 days from October 7th to the 24th. It really doesn't demonstrate too much change in the number of cases reported. Dr. Morgan is not lifting the ban on public gatherings. Note the number of deaths, almost the same number at Fort Harrison alone as compared to the entire city. And this doesn't even include the deaths at other Army schools. On the 25th, Eli Lilly, hundreds of men and women are not counting the hours working to produce an immunizing vaccine. It goes on to report that women have been recruited from the ranks of teachers off work because of the influenza-related school closures. Bill?
And I think it's important to note here that for all of the hope in the fall of 1918 that there would be an effective and scalable vaccine, that never happened. We didn't develop flu vaccines until very recent times.
The last paragraph of this article says, when the soldier girls took the men's jobs, Mr. Lilly offered the men's pay, and they're getting it. I don't know how long that lasted, but it did for a while. Here's Sunday, October the 27th, making recommendations for the patient, but also to others around the patient to best reduce the risk to themselves. Here is a continued recruiting of women for nursing, the Emergency Nurses Bureau. Now they're looking for trained, but also untrained women to help in the pandemic. This is a listing from the 29th Star October. You'll note as you glance through this, there's many listings of deaths due to influenza and pneumonia, but you'll also see a variety of other infectious causes of death. Diphtheria, tubercular meningitis, mastoiditis, septicemia, meningitis, tuberculosis, all pointing out that infectious causes were a very common cause of death a century ago. By Halloween, October the 31st, the city is lifting the flu ban, talking about how they're going to be resuming the banless Indianapolis. By November the 2nd, the flu plague is almost ended, a significant reduction in cases. The Hotel Lincoln has found an increase in business, 5 special dinner parties booked, big increase in coffee shop patronage. And by November the 8th, Indiana is getting back to normal. No influenza at Notre Dame. Notre Dame will play football again that day. Interestingly, Notre Dame is playing against Great Lakes. Bill?
And that all sounds familiar to what we're experiencing right now. And it's this desire for normalcy. We want to get back to having football, having NBA basketball, having the 500-mile race. It's just a part of the human condition. And it's as real in 1918 as it is in 2020.
And here the quarantine is lifted at Camp Taylor in Louisville, and they're expecting the first new draft of troops in 2 months, a few days later on December the 2nd. Now this is the end of part 1. I'm going to change the PowerPoints here, and Bill, you can take it away for a minute here.
Okay, well, one of the things that we've been talking about is the similarities between the pandemic in 1918 and the COVID-19 today. And we should also point out that there are a number of differences, and perhaps the biggest difference, and we'll go into this in much greater detail, but perhaps the biggest difference that you see in 1918 vis-a-vis today is that the age of the victims was vastly different. Today, the mortality rate among people over the age of about 70 is pretty frightening. In 1918, the Spanish influenza attacked people in the age range between 17 and about 35. And that was one of the big differences. Another big difference that you have between the 1918 pandemic and the COVID today is the hospital, the role of hospitals and mortality. This thing in 1918 was much more quick acting than the COVID-19. I mean, we've seen evidence of people being in hospital on ventilators today for upwards of 3 to 4 weeks. Back then, there wasn't the concern, or at least I don't see it going through the contemporary newspaper accounts. There wasn't the concern about hospital beds or about the availability of ICU beds or medical equipment, because people would come down with the flu. Young people would come down with the flu at 9 o'clock this morning and they would be dead by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. It was that fast acting. And I think that's something that you have to realize about the pandemic in 1918 versus the COVID-19 today, is that if you got it in 1918, it could be very fatal very quickly. So, Bill, if you're ready.
I am. Let's move on to part two. So are you seeing a part two on your screen, Bill?
I am.
Okay. Then you should see here.
I'm seeing it. I think everybody else is, I hope.
I will hope so too.
Okay.
So what you're seeing now is an image of the fourth extra edition published by the Indianapolis News on Monday, November the 11th, Armistice Day. The war in Europe, the troops, the war to end all wars, Armistice. And so this is on Monday, November the 11th. Here is from the next day in the Indianapolis Star, November the 12th, describing a big party going on, a whiz-banger of hours and hours duration, celebrating the signing of the Armistice and the end of World War. If you move to the right, you can read where every available inch of space on the circle and nearby was packed with people from wall to wall. So it was a big event. Everyone came downtown. There was a big party, and it was just packed all through the downtown area. That was on the 12th. On the 14th, there's mention that there's spotty disease remaining here, there, and yon in the state. By the 16th, here is made mention of what was happening in Indiana in October in terms of the number of reported cases. And then if you look at the front pages, really the focus on the front page is on the returning troops in the end of the war. This is on Saturday morning, November the 16th. This is page 1. If you do get over to page 8, then you start finding something about influenza again, and the warning that flu is gaining headway since the mingling of the crowds during the peace celebrations and the epidemic has shown a decided increase. Increase in new cases to 123 as compared to 45 to 50 the prior week. Bill?
And notice in the paragraph down at the bottom right of the screen, influenza continued to rage in a number of mining communities and several other counties in the state. Well, again, this whole concept that we're dealing with today with meat packing plants where people are closely packed together. When you're working underground at a coal seam, you're pretty much packed together in that man skip going down to the coal seam. Great way to transmit any kind of viral disease.
Here is November the 18th, and the health board orders masks. No one in public without the gauze protectors. Public schools are closed. Churches may be closed. And to read what it says here, the renewal of the epidemic is due largely to the fact that during the recent celebrations, people forgot to take care of themselves and their resistance became lowered. Avoid crowds. The safest place is in the home or in the open air. The following day, epidemic fight is up to the people. Masks are being worn generally. Ventilation of streetcars is insisted as being on, this despite temperatures in the 30s here in November. Here is a slide taken from the Indianapolis News on the 19th of November. Flu masks must be worn in all public places. Talks about where they're to be worn, how to make one, and conveniently, the William H. Armstrong Company just has happens to have plenty of surgical gauze for sale for making your own masks. Flu drops off on the city's first day in masks. So that's good to see this, this drop that we can identify here on the 21st. Here is an advertisement from the William H. Block Company. And apparently people were wearing masks, because if you read the top of it, through many a flu mask came numerous such as expressions as, "I'll take these too." And so what was going on is people apparently wearing masks that were coming in to buy shirts from the William H. Block Company. On the 23rd, increase in flu epidemic. And you note on the left here, Secretary of Health Board denounces knockers who object to masks, he says, handicap officials, and threatens to close the city if that's what's necessary. And if you look in the upper right, when a community is confronted with a serious epidemic, the cooperation of the majority of the people is absolutely necessary to make any preventive measures adopted a success. This is not a time for destructive criticism, petty jealousies, or all-time knockers, but an occasion for every individual to aid in the enforcement of the preventative measures to the end that disease and death may be reduced to a minimum. November the 24th, the flu mask order stands, but we're going to soften it a little bit, and some options are permissible here. By the 26th, I think this is a kind of an important slide pointing out that there's a lot of deaths, and because of these deaths involving many individuals in their 20s and 30s, there's now lots of orphans that have resulted from these deaths. On Tuesday, November the 26th, masks ordered off, care urged. The health board rescinds. If you look on the right, from later on in this article, 47 counties report new cases. And on down towards the bottom, interestingly enough, Cass and Decatur counties were two of the hospitals that reported new increases. Epidemic of influenza still shows increases, and the official describes the situation as bad across Indiana here on the 28th. Here's an advertisement for the efficacy of Pluto water, the foe of the flu, bottled in French Lick, Indiana, for sale at your druggist, your club, your hotel, cafes, and on trains. Also pretty much good for what ails you, yes. On Saturday, November the 23rd, 3 Indiana teams are playing. Bill?
And one of the fascinating things about this article is the lead says the most disastrous season from a financial standpoint in the history of Middle West football will close today. And you look again at what's going on today. This past week, the Big Ten announced that they're going to play only conference games in their fall sports schedule. So Ball State University, which had a couple of big payday games lined up against the University of Michigan and IU, will lose those games. And so from their financial standpoint, this is going to be the most disastrous season since 1918.
Well, for those sports fans among us who have been really hankering for results, Purdue was whipped by Great Lakes 27-0. Butler scraps Rose to a 0-0 tie. And then for you high school round ball fans, Liberty beats Shortridge 18-14 in a rough, fast game. Here's from December the 1st. Things are starting to calm down, and makes mention of making plans to fight the flu when it's returned the next year. December the 4th, October death rate in Indiana is up 100% over the prior year. December the 8th, the flu is showing a slight gain, 64 cases versus 62 the prior week here in Indianapolis. December the 11th, we're seeing a decline in cases, 29% decline in influenza pneumonia cases in November in Indianapolis as compared to October. This is from a report on a medical convention. Makes mention that recent figures indicate that the influenza epidemic played almost as much havoc in the Army as did the bullets of the Germans. There is disagreement among physicians on how best to treat the influenza epidemic, but there's good agreement that the disease is hard to define and hard to control. Finally, on December the 16th, it's the first fluless days in Indianapolis. So we'll see if that really holds. In fact, it doesn't. But by November into December and on into January, we are seeing a continued decline of the incidence of influenza in Indianapolis. So moving on then to some information from sources other than Indianapolis newspapers. We look at the deaths in Indiana, not Indianapolis, but Indiana. We can see that the deaths in Indiana were substantially higher in September and October of 1918 as compared to October the previous year or the previous month. If we think of World War I, this was a period of time of lots of US troop mobilization. Men of 18 to 38 years from across the country moved across the country and gathered in close communities for training. Lots of transport from site to site and back and forth to the UK and Europe. World War I was industrial warfare, increased efficacy of killing methods, lots of trench warfare, and clearly produced a major loss in life. And yet, if you look at this diagram of total deaths in the United States Army from 17 through 19, and look on the right, you can see that there's more deaths from disease than there is from battle. This is an image of the total deaths in the United States Army, 1918 through the first 4 months of 1919. You'll see this major spike in deaths between September and November of 1919. The Department of Commerce publishes some special tables of mortality. We can look through here, read a little bit about Indianapolis, estimated 445,000 deaths from the epidemic in the United States in the last 4 months of 1918. And this is what this focuses on. It points out that the epidemic did not end until well into 1919, but that's not covered here. These figures and diagrams only cover the last 4 months of 1918. Makes mention here that the deaths were about 20.2 per thousand in 1918, as compared to 20.9 in the same months in 1917, a 56% increase in Indianapolis. The death rates in Indiana and Kansas were about the same, with higher rates in cities than in rural districts, but both were substantially lower than in Philadelphia. This is a graph that looks at Indianapolis, looks at males. Along the bottom of it is ages of individuals, age 0 on the left to age 64 on the right. And you can see where it has primary in the arrow. This spike that goes up has a major annual death rate, normalized to population, that spikes up for individuals peaking out at about age 28 and then going down from there. All others, you'll see more at the lower end and the higher end, but influenza is particularly noticeable as having a major effect on individuals in their 20s and 30s. So this is with men, and this is a graph of the same for women, and the same sort of um, effective age holds for women as well as men. This is a graph that looks at the death rate per 100,000. And if we look at this, and we can see here, looking in this age range, this is the death rate per 100,000 for all causes. We can see it's high in the young, it's high in the old, and here in the middle, it's kind of a stable but gradually growing number. On the other hand, if you look over here at deaths from influenza, primary and contributing causes, it really spikes up here as compared to the previous numbers in prior years. If we look at the US population density, this kind of skews things a little bit because you can see here in 1920, the population is a much younger population than we see here in a similar graph from 2010. Substantially smaller numbers, as recall, there were not really effective treatments for many of the infections and other disorders that we have treatments for today. This is a diagram that looks from 1900 to 1918, and you can see here that the deaths from pneumonia of all causes is always high, but it just really spikes up here due to this influenza pandemic that occurs in 1918. But also notice if you look through here that in addition, there's lots of infectious causes of disease that manifest here in this graph of causes of death. This is a diagram that looks at, it's a fairly recent article that looks at the death rates in a variety of different cities. The blue squares represent actual weekly excess mortality over expected mortality. And here in Indianapolis, you can see that there was a bit of a bump that occurred here. All of these are days after the 7th of September. So if you look in Baltimore or Philadelphia, you can see that the pandemic appears there earlier. The green is what would be predicted by these investigators if there had not been the implementation of various public health interventions. So public health did make a difference, and Indianapolis did, I think, really quite well in terms of damping down the mortality as compared to many other cities in the United States. If we look at Crown Hill Cemetery and look at the burials, we can see that there was a spiking up of burials in October and less so in November as compared to September of 1918. And of these deaths, about 43% of them here in October list influenza or pneumonia as the cause of death. This is an image of section 54 at Crown Hill. There's 143 burials here between October the 4th and December the 9th of 1918. About 52% of these deaths were from influenza or pneumonia. And this looks then at the timeline across the United States from 1918 and 19. You can see here there was a big spike up. This is what we've been talking about in late 1918. It came down. There was a further spike, but nowhere near as high in 1919 as compared to 1918. Let's then move on and spend a little bit of time looking at COVID-19. Reminder, COVID-19 is the coronavirus disease. First occurring in 20 should be 19 rather than 29. Caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus type 2. We'll look at some of the data from the State Board of Health records. The first in other places, the first appearance worldwide, early December of 2019. First appearance in the United States is January the 19th. First appearance in Indiana and Marion County is on March the 6th. This is data that I pulled from the Indiana State Board of Health website. I pulled this yesterday. I looked at it today. There's a little bit of a decline here in the Marion County positive cases by day. Starts over here on March the 6th. The last day here is in July the 10th. So we can see that we had a spike. There was a gradual decline, but we've got a little bit of concerning increase here, occurring just a few days after this 3-day July 4th weekend. So it'll be, I think, instructive to see what happens over the next week or so. Does this come right back down, or do we see an increase going up that might be relating to some activities that occurred over the July 4th long weekend? So these are positive cases by day. These are deaths by day. In Marion County, you can see that it goes up and unfortunately is coming back down now. If we look at the Marion County demographics, positive cases, you can see how it is peaking out here in the 20 to 50-year-olds, particularly the 30 to 40-year-olds. These are the positive cases. But if you look at the demographics for deaths here in Marion County, the deaths skew much higher. So in comparison to the deaths that we looked at earlier related to influenza peaking out here in the 20s to 40s, clearly we're seeing a different entity in terms of the demographics, with the deaths for coronavirus skewing to a much older population. Marion County cumulative deaths over a period of time. If we do a little bit of calculation then, our deaths due to COVID-19 in Marion County from March 6th to the July the 10th, 684. Population that works out to about 72 deaths due to COVID-19 per 100,000 in the population. If we do the same calculation due to pneumonia and influenza, we come up with a figure of 310. So as we are now living through the concerns and the problems and all of what's going on with COVID-19, I think it gives some perspective to realize that the per capita deaths were over 4 times as high related to the influenza pandemic seen in Indianapolis in 1918. That pretty much takes us to the end of what we'd planned to cover today. Thanks to folks at Crown Hill and with the Archdiocese of Indianapolis for information that they provided. Thanks a lot to Sarah, the director of the Indiana Medical History Museum, for inviting us to present on this topic and for her technical assistance in working us through. And we invite you to check out the Marion County Historical Society website for future county history programs. And as a reminder, wear your mask, clean your hands, keep your distance, and avoid crowds, especially indoors. Sarah, that's it.
We do have a few questions from the audience.
Okay, then let me stop sharing.
Okay.
And okay, there we go.
Let me get to the beginning of my list here. We had a good question from Dana Connor, who wanted to know what was used for the fumigation that you mentioned, kind of going back to the earliest part of your presentation. Was it formaldehyde or something else?
Good question. I don't have an answer to that one.
What was the question?
What did they use as a fumigant?
Oh, that's a good question.
I thought so too.
That's a good question.
Well, maybe we'll try to do a little digging and see if we can answer
Yeah.
that.
We
Yeah.
will do that. For things that we don't know the answer to, we can certainly come back and
I wouldn't be surprised if it was vinegar.
Hmm.
They would have had lots of vinegar back in those days. I wouldn't be surprised if they were using that.
we'll try and find some recommendations and report back to Sarah, and she can get the information out to us.
Yeah.
Excellent.
What else is on the list?
We had two questions that were kind of along the same line. So Kathleen Hall asked, were citizens compliant in wearing the gauze face coverings in 1918? And I know there was resistance to it, but overall, like in general, were people pretty good about that? And then Brenda Havens asked why the mask order was rescinded when it was.
So I think there's a yes and a no answer. So we know from the advertisement of the William Block Company that at least individuals coming into the Block store and buying silk shirts were wearing masks, as being described there in the lead of that advertisement. We see some images from the time of people wearing masks, but we also know that there was certainly pushback. The knockers, as was described, people pushing back against the recommendations on how to try and blunt this pandemic. So I think the answer is yes and no. There was some, but clearly those in the health administration, public health administration, weren't entirely happy, and they were trying to encourage better adherence to the methods that were available to reduce transmission. As to why the mask wearing was recommendations were withdrawn, I have to believe it's a combination of both some gradual improvement in the amount of influenza being seen. If all of it was a result of everyone getting together for the Armistice celebration timeline, that in and of itself would have reduced it some. The mask could have reduced it some. And clearly there was a desire being voiced to try and get rid of this mask wearing and get things back to normal.
I think one of the comments that I ran across was Dr. Morgan in an interview from the Marion County Public Health Department made the point. He said, "We are not ordering the mask wearing on a whim. It works." And it's much the same argument that you see today. It's not something that we just picked out of a hat someplace. It works. It cuts down the transmission of the droplets.
Thank you. Amy Waltermeyer asked, well, this is not in the form of a question. She's interested to know how tracking positive cases happened then versus now. Like I think is what she's referring to.
I'm sorry, again, please.
I suspect what she's referring to, and she could correct me in the chat, but contact tracing. Were these positive cases being tracked in 1918 the way they are now?
I can't say that I read anything specifically about that. Bill, have you?
I think it was much more of an experiential type of thing. I don't think there was a lot of testing for it in 1918. It was, I'm sick, I don't feel good, I'm hacking up, I'm coughing, and somebody from the public health department took your name, and that was it. And told you to go to bed and get a lot of rest and drink a lot of fluids. If you were sick enough, you went to the hospital, and frequently died there.
Claire Parker asks, is it accurate to compare the deaths per 100,000 for an epidemic that is already over versus one that is still ongoing?
Well, I think it's accurate to compare at least the first 3 to 4 months. So if we look at COVID, clearly it's not over. The epidemic of 1918 was not over at the end of December, but it was clearly declining. So that's kind of what we can compare for the first 3 to 4 months.
Okay. We also had another question about literacy rates. What was the literacy rate, if you know, in 1918? So, you know, all of these announcements and advice in the newspaper, how many people were actually seeing that? Were enough people literate for that to be significant?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, I've been, I was kind of fascinated by how well informed people were in 1918. And remember, you had multiple newspapers in the city of Indianapolis. You had the Indianapolis Star, the Indianapolis News, Times, I'm not sure that the Journal was still around, but you had German newspapers, German language newspapers, and the newspapers had very large staffs of reporters, and they covered this thing. This was a big news event in September, October, November, December of 1918. If you go into newspapers.com and you type in Spanish Influenza, Indianapolis, September 1, 1918, December 31, 1918, I think you come up with several thousand hits. It was very well covered. I think people were very, very well aware of what was going on.
This is another good question. You know, we've seen a lot in the news about certain groups of people being adversely affected by the disease. Were all races accounted for in the rates of infection or death, especially in 1918?
I think the answer to that is yes. And I say that because if you remember the I can't think of the name of it, but it was the Department of Commerce big publication. It specifically had information that broke results out on a basis of race. So yes, I believe that the information was there at least at a level of white, non-white. I don't think it went in any greater depth than that.
Yeah. I don't know whether you could answer this question or not, but I think it's interesting, and I'm gonna ask it from one of our attendees. Was the election affected in any way because of the pandemic?
It was basically an off-year congressional election. Okay. Congressional and state office election. I don't think it was. I don't have, from going back and reading a lot of the newspaper articles, I don't get any sense that in 1918 there was much involvement of politicians from any side of the spectrum. All of the information was coming from the Indianapolis Board of Public Health and from the Indiana State Board of Public Health. It was Dr. Morgan and Dr. Hurdy who were driving all of the information and seemingly making all of the decisions. So it was just very, very public health oriented.
There's one more question. Going back to the newspapers, was the Indianapolis Recorder included in
the Recorder, unfortunately, is not on newspaper.com, nor is, I believe, the Indianapolis Times. So no, it is not on newspapers.com. You would have to go, I think, through the recorder, and I'm not sure they have it digitized. But it would be very interesting to run the recorder and to see how it was reported in 1918 vis-a-vis the other newspapers in the city.
Well, I think that's all of the questions that we have. So thank you, the Bills, as I call you. I don't know if you guys know that I call you the Bills. But thank you so much. This has been a great presentation. We really appreciate you being here with us today. And also thank you to everyone who participated. Again, this will be recorded, so keep an eye out for the post if you want to share it with folks or if you want to watch it again because it was so amazing. So
Okay.
thank you.
All right.
Terrific.
All right. Thank you very much.
Stay well.